Now on Overnights,
I believe in reason and common sense.
Leith Van Onselen from Macro Business with the Treasury of Common Sense.
Common sense never goes out of style.
Here he is, the man who can't sleep because his mind is just churning through common sense. How are you, Leith?
Yeah, good, thanks, Phil. How about yourself?
I'm very good. Fewer Australians can afford to have children. What do we attribute this to?
Yeah, this is actually some pretty interesting data that came out this week. Now, just to give a little bit of background on it, Australia's birth rate has basically been falling for about 70 years. So pretty much since the baby boom in the 1950s, 60s, that sort of thing. And it's basically, a birth rate's around half what it was back then during the baby boom. And the latest Australian Bureau of Statistics fertility rate data revealed that Australia's total fertility rate, so that's basically the number of children per woman, it fell to its lowest level on record in 2023, which is the latest data we've got, and it fell to 1.5 babies per woman. So that was the lowest on record. And just to put that into perspective, it was 1.67 just before the pandemic, and in the 2010s it was an average of about 1.82. So the total fertility rate's fallen. And also, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, the ABS reported that the median age of parents also hit a record high in 2023 of about 34 years for fathers and about 32 years for mothers in 2023. So, it's worth also pointing out that Australia's fertility rate of 1.5 is only slightly higher than Japan's was a decade ago, which is interesting because a decade ago when Japan's birth rate was, slightly less than Australia's now, but not significantly less. Basically, demographers around the world were basically ringing alarm bells about Japan's demographics. So, we're not that far above where Japan was a decade ago. And last week, the Australian Bureau of Statistics released the March quarter population data, and it showed that natural increase, so that's, not net overseas migration, that's all the other stuff. So it's basically births minus deaths. It was at a historically low level of 107,500 over the year. And that's almost the lowest on record. So it's slightly, higher than it was in, say, the December quarter of last year, but it's basically hovering around this record low level. So I've got like a record low level of net births. And this week, the University of Melbourne released its annual household income and labour dynamics survey. And what that revealed is that Australians often have fewer children than was the case 20 years ago, which is obviously implied by this separate ABS data. And what it showed is that there's a notable trend towards people having small families or outright childlessness, so not having children at all. And the share of people desiring no children has seen the biggest increase over the last 20 years. And Hilda puts the decrease in people wanting to have children basically down to financial concerns. So the general cost of raising children was rated as the most important factor for women and men deciding not to have children or deciding to have fewer children.
Yep.
And also other financial concerns like things like, job security, the cost of childcare, the cost of housing, all these sorts of things are basically dissuading Australians from having children. And it was also interesting, the Hilda survey also showed that once you adjust for inflation, households are spending an average of 38% more on childcare than they were in 2006. And here's the kicker, 40.5% more on rent. So that's once you adjust for inflation than they were in 2006. So while it's not the only factor, rising housing costs, so that's both to purchase a house or to rent a house, is presenting a barrier to Australians having children. And according to Cotality, which they used to be known as CoreLogic, they're basically one of the main housing data providers. They showed that at the end of last year, the cost of buying and servicing a mortgage on an Australian property was at its highest level ever. And also the cost of renting as a share of income was also at the highest ever level. And according to HSBC, who did some research on Australia, they showed that a 10% increase in house prices leads to a 1.3% drop in birth rates. And the impact's even more with rising rents. And the HSBC's data for Australia actually mirrors almost perfectly American data from the National Bureau of Economic Research, which showed that a 10% rise in home prices leads to a 1% drop in births in metro areas. And it's also worth noting, Phil, that, and this kind of reflects the whole housing story, the birth rate is significantly higher in Australia's regions than in the capital cities, because regional areas, and I assume this is the reason why, regional areas have much or significantly cheaper housing than capital cities. So as a result, people can afford to have more children in those places. And also, I'd argue that people might move out of, say, Sydney or Brisbane or Melbourne in the regional areas to have more children because it's cheaper, so they can actually afford to have more children. And I'd also argue that, Australia's obviously running a very high immigration program at the moment, or it really has for the last 20 years. And one of the reasons why it's run this high immigration program is to basically cover for this declining birth rate. But the problem with it is, by running this high immigration program, it's one of the main drivers of Australia's rising housing costs. So it obviously puts upward pressure on prices, but more so on rents. And as a result, as the birth rate's fallen and the government's ramped up immigration to compensate, that's driven up the cost of housing, which is then driving down the birth rate. So kind of this chicken and egg, negative feedback loop.
Of course, yeah.
Which is obviously not good. And as a result, we're now in this bizarre situation whereby net overseas migration is making up an historically large proportion of Australia's population growth. So in the population data released last week, it showed that net overseas migration was accounted for three-quarters of Australia's population growth, and natural increase, which I've said before has fallen to a historic low, was only 25%. And actually, the previous couple of years before that, net overseas migration was running over 80% of population growth. So, and there's another issue here, Phil. By running such a high immigration program, you're also altering the way that we're living, because when places like Sydney and Brisbane or Melbourne grow aggressively, it means that in order to accommodate all these extra millions of extra people, you've got to build high-rise apartments. But the problem with it is high-rise apartments are then not conducive to raising children because most of them are sort of, 1 and 2 bedroom apartments, and they're not places where you can actually raise a decent-sized family. Yeah. So these are all factors that are basically, forcing Australians to have fewer children than they otherwise would. And there's some interesting data in Sydney from the Urban Task Force. It showed that as of 2016, it basically did a survey a few years ago, and it was based on the 2016 census. So it's a little bit dated, but it gives you the idea. So back in 2016, 55% of Sydney's homes were detached houses, and only 30% were apartments and the rest were townhouses. But by 2057, the Urban Task Force forecast that only 25% of Sydney dwellings will be detached houses and 50% will be apartments with the rest townhouses. So as our major capital cities grow and as we become more dense and living in high-rise apartments and as housing becomes more expensive, which inevitably will, both to rent and purchase, it means that it's going to basically act as a major barrier to Australians having children, because who's going to want to raise their child in a high-rise 2-bedroom apartment or a one-bedroom apartment, which are the majority of dwellings that are being built now in these places, and who's going to actually be able to afford to raise a family in these places when rents are predicted to keep rising faster than incomes, and property prices will inevitably rise faster than incomes as well. So, this is a concern, and the two major migrant groups now that are coming to Australia are actually from India and China. And here's the interesting thing. Based on the ABS's data, mothers from China and India actually have lower birth rates than the Australian-born population, which is quite interesting. So we're basically importing a whole bunch of people from, say, China and India who actually have fewer children on average than the existing Australian-born population. So the upshot of all this is that the outlook for Australia's birth rate is actually very poor because housing costs are rising. Dwelling composition is becoming more high density, which is not conducive to family living. And the two greatest migrant groups that we're bringing in, who are actually dominating migration into Australia, are from India and China. And those cohorts, on average, have fewer children per woman than the Australian-born population. Yeah. So it's a pretty diabolical situation here, and the solution is obviously, if we're going to solve this problem, we need to basically lower the overall cost of housing, as well as the overall, general cost of living, so people can actually afford to have children. But unfortunately, all the policies that Australia runs, whether it's, the immigration side, which is driving up housing costs, or, the energy policy, which is driving up our energy bills, and everything else, our housing policies, they're all basically pushing up the cost of living, which is reducing the nation's capacity to actually have children. And then the government's then trying to compensate by running a high immigration program, but then we're importing people who have less children. So that's actually, driving up the cost of housing even more. But then the people we import are having less children, so that's actually making the situation worse. So unfortunately, Phil, the upshot of this is that having a family in Australia is becoming a luxury. And it's likely to get even worse in the future as, for all these factors I've just mentioned, higher density housing, more expensive housing, rising cost of living, and the migrants that we're bringing are tending to have fewer children than the Australian-born population.
Right. See, this is why you are the CEO of the Department of Common Sense, my friend. And if people want to read more about this, where can they go?
Yeah, thanks, Phil. They can go to macrobusiness.com.au.